They chose genocide against humanity. Earth's response shattered every peace treaty. The signal died at 03:47 station time. Not static, not a gradual fade. It cut clean and total, like someone had reached across 12 light years and simply switched humanity off. I was sitting in the monitoring bay of Relay Station Copernicus when it happened. My name is Ilara Voss. I had been an intelligence officer for 11 years, and in 11 years I had learned to tell the difference between a technical failure and something else. Technical failures are messy. They stutter. They leave debris in the data. This left nothing. 12 colony signals, gone in the same second. I pulled the display closer and ran a secondary verification. Then a third. My hands were steady. That surprised me, because something in my chest had already understood what my brain was still refusing to process. I opened a channel to my supervisor, Colonel Owen Price, who was 3 decks up reviewing trade manifests. "Colonel," I said, "you need to come down here." "Voss, I'm in the middle of." "Now, sir." He heard something in my voice. He came. Owen was a tall man with gray at his temples and the kind of calm that comes from surviving things most people never see. He looked at my screen for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the secondary screen. Then the tertiary. "Run the atmospheric grid check," he said quietly. I had already run it. The results were waiting on the left panel. He read them once. He sat down in the nearest chair with the slow, careful movement of someone who no longer trusts their own legs. 12 colony worlds, 3 billion people, the atmospheric processors, the machines that kept breathable air cycling on every human colony had stopped, not malfunctioned, not been damaged by some natural event. They had been hit by something the Concord's own technical registry listed as a theoretical weapon, a silence grid, a device that, according to the publicly available Concord science archives, did not yet exist in deployable form. Except it did. I had read every diplomatic brief produced by Earth's Foreign Relations Office for the past 7 years. I had sat in rooms with Concord representatives and listened to their careful, measured words about cooperation and shared futures. I had believed, genuinely believed, that we were building something. I thought about the reception on Concord Station 9, 4 years earlier. The long tables, the lights that cycled through colors no human eye had ever evolved to appreciate, the Keth Dominion's senior envoy, a tall, pale being called Sarath Vor, extending one long-fingered hand in the human gesture of a handshake, which they had practiced because they wanted us to feel welcome. I had shaken that hand. I had smiled. I sat in the monitoring bay of Relay Station Copernicus, and I understood with absolute clarity that the handshake had been theater, the smile had been strategy, and the dinner we had attended last week, a formal reception hosted by the Concorde to celebrate the 5th anniversary of humanity's admission, had been a distraction. I checked the timestamp on the Concorde's vote authorization for what would later be known as Resolution 7, the document that had legally permitted the use of the silence grid against human colony worlds. The vote had been held 4 days ago. We had been at a ceremony. Our delegates had been eating food prepared by Concord hospitality staff and listening to speeches about unity. The vote had passed, every member, including the species we had believed were our friends, including the Vethani, who had sent a delegation to Earth's first interstellar cultural exchange, including the Morath Collective, whose ambassador had wept, actually produced fluid from their ocular organs in what their species biologists confirmed was equivalent to weeping during a performance of human music in New Geneva. They had wept, and then they had voted yes. Owen was already on a secured channel to Earth Command. I could hear the low murmur of his voice behind me, the tight, controlled language of a man delivering the worst possible news in the most precise possible terms. I pulled up the Concorde's official statement, transmitted to all member species at 03:48 station time, 1 minute after the signal deaths. It was 3 paragraphs long. It used words like resource allocation and population optimization and sustainable galactic balance. It referred to humanity as a Class 4 developmental species that had exceeded its permitted resource footprint. 3 billion people, 3 paragraphs. I read it twice. I saved it to a personal file I labeled simply, Record. A new signal came in at 0412. It was not from Earth. It was from the Keth Dominion's primary communications relay, addressed to all Earth-registered stations and vessels. I opened it. The voice was synthetic, a translation program, but the words had been composed by Sarath Vor personally. I recognized the phrasing style from years of studying Keth diplomatic language. It said that Earth was invited to acknowledge the terms of Resolution 7 and begin voluntary compliance procedures. It said that resistance would be considered a hostile act against the conquered and would be met accordingly. It said that the Keth Dominion understood this was a difficult moment for humanity and that patience would be extended for a period of 72 standard hours. Patience? They were offering us patience. I thought about 3 billion people who no longer needed anyone's patience. Owen finished his channel call and walked back to where I was sitting. He looked at the Keth transmission still open on my screen. He read it without touching the display. "They think we're going to answer that," he said, "not a question." "They think we're going to comply," I said. Owen was quiet for a moment. Outside the station's viewport, the stars were entirely normal. They had no idea. They just hung there in the dark, the same as always, while everything changed beneath them. "The Hephaestus authorization code," Owen said. "Do you have clearance for that tier?" "No," I said. "You do now." He pressed his command seal to my console. "I'm transmitting it in the next 60 seconds. When it arrives, you'll know where to go." "What are you going to do?" He looked at me. Owen Price, who had gray at his temples and the kind of calm that comes from surviving things. He looked genuinely tired in the deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. "I'm going to compose the official response to that transmission," he said. "What will it say?" He was already walking toward his office. He answered without turning around. "Nothing," he said. "It won't say a single word, because silence is the only language they spoke to us tonight, and I think it's time we responded in kind." The authorization code arrived 40 seconds later. I had my orders. I had my destination. I had a clear picture of what had been done and who had done it and why. What I did not have, not yet, was any idea of what humanity was actually capable of when it stopped trying to be welcome in someone else's galaxy and started remembering what it had always been. That education was about to begin. I closed the Keth transmission without archiving it. Let their patience expire. Let their 72 hours tick down into nothing. Let them check their diplomatic channels and find only quiet on the other end. We had spent 30 years learning how to speak their languages. It was past time they learned what ours sounded like. I left the monitoring bay at 0431. The stars outside were still indifferent, still beautiful, still entirely unaware that the species born beneath one of them had just stopped being afraid. The Hephaestus authorization code unlocked a location rather than a door. Sector 7, null in the outer asteroid belt, officially designated as Resource Processing Depot 14 on every public registry, every Concord shared navigation chart, every diplomatic transparency filing Earth had ever submitted. It was not a resource processing depot. I arrived on a courier vessel with a crew of 4 who did not ask questions, which told me they already knew more than their clearance levels officially permitted. The journey took 19 hours. I spent most of it reading personnel files, because Owen had transmitted a secondary package along with the authorization code, and that package contained names. The name at the top was Director Yusuf Ademi. I had heard the name once, 3 years earlier, in a conversation I was not supposed to be part of. An aide to Earth's chief science officer had mentioned it in passing, Adami's team, the long game people, and then immediately changed the subject. I had filed it in the part of my memory reserved for things worth revisiting later. Later had arrived. Hephaestus Station was large. That was the first thing that struck me as our courier matched velocity with its docking port. From the outside, it looked industrial, which was intentional. A sprawling collection of pressurized modules and connector tubes that could, at a glance, be mistaken for any of the dozens of legitimate mining operations scattered through the belt. But a mining operation does not need shielded power cores visible on the deep scan equipment I was running from the courier's navigation seat. A mining operation does not need the kind of communications array I could see folded flat against the station's dorsal surface, currently retracted, but designed to deploy in a wideband burst pattern that would reach every corner of the inner system simultaneously. The docking port opened. I stepped through, and for the first time since 03:47 station time the previous day, I felt something that was not grief or fury or the cold procedural focus I had been using to keep both of those things from overwhelming me. It was something closer to awe. The interior of Hephaestus was not what I expected. I had imagined a military installation, gray corridors, uniformed personnel, the institutional smell of recycled air and pressure seals. What I found instead was something closer to a university that had been running for 20 years without ever scheduling graduation. Every surface had data on it, not decoration, actual work. Schematics pinned to corridor walls with annotations in 4 different handwriting styles. Whiteboards covered in equations that spilled onto adjacent whiteboards and kept going. Teams of engineers and physicists and materials scientists moving through the corridors with the focused energy of people who had been waiting for someone to finally need what they had been building. Yusuf Adami met me at the inner docking junction. He was shorter than I expected, somewhere in his mid-60s, with close-cropped white hair and the kind of eyes that did not stop moving, not nervously, but observationally, cataloging everything they passed over. He shook my hand. His grip was firm but not performed. "Commander Voss," he said, "I've read your intelligence assessments from the past 3 years. You were the closest anyone in the diplomatic corps got to seeing this coming." "Not close enough," I said. "No," he agreed without softening it, "but that's done, come." He walked fast. I matched his pace. As we moved through the station, he talked, the kind of talking that is actually thinking out loud, organized and precise, the speech pattern of a man who had been waiting to say these things to someone who could use them. 22 years ago, Yusuf Adami had been a young propulsion engineer assigned to the first joint human-Vethani research project following our initial contact with the Concord. The project was a standard scientific exchange, both species sharing development data on faster-than-light navigation principles. The Vethani had been generous. They had shared quite a lot. Yusuf had been grateful and curious and methodical. He had also noticed something that the exchange's official reports did not mention. The technology the Vethani shared was real. It worked, but it was also old, not cutting-edge, not their best. They had given humanity the equivalent of last decade's tools while presenting it as state-of-the-art, and they had done it so smoothly and warmly that no one in the official delegation had caught it. Yusuf had caught it. He had filed a quiet report to a specific office within Earth's Defense Intelligence Division, an office that did not appear on the public organizational chart. The office had responded by reassigning him, not as a punishment, as an investment. For 22 years, that office and its growing network of researchers had done 2 things in parallel. First, they had reverse-engineered every piece of technology humanity received through Concord channels, not with hostility but with rigor, understanding each gift fully rather than accepting the version of it they were meant to accept. Second, they had taken humanity's own existing capabilities and asked a simple question. If we could not rely on our allies, if we had no access to conquered technology, if we had to build everything ourselves, what would we build? The answer was in every corridor of Hephaestus Station. Yusuf showed me the Harrier platforms first. Compact, fast, built entirely from human materials and human engineering, no conquered components, no borrowed propulsion systems. They looked nothing like the elegant vessels in the Conquered's fleet registries. They looked like something designed by people who had grown up building things in garages and workshops, who had learned to make every component serve three functions because you never knew which two would fail. They were, in the bluntest possible terms, ugly and effective. "Fold space-breaching charges," Yusuf said, stopping in front of a display case that looked almost absurdly small for what it contained. Each charge was about the size of a human fist. The Conquered considers this technology to be 40 years from practical deployment. They based that estimate on the assumption that the only viable approach was the one they were pursuing. "There was another approach," I said. "There are always other approaches," he said. "We just had more incentive to find them." The communications array I had seen from the courier was the next stop. Yusuf called it the thread, a system that transmitted information not through conventional signal channels, but through a method so genuinely novel that I struggled to follow the underlying physics even after 30 minutes of explanation. What I understood was the result. It could not be jammed because it did not use any channel the Conquered's jamming technology was built to target. It did not look from the outside like a transmission at all. "They'll find it eventually," Yusuf said, "but not before we've used it." A broadcast came through the station's main speaker system while we were standing in the propulsion lab. It was Earth's Global Council, a live address, transmitted on all frequencies directed to the entire solar system. The voice belonged to Council Chair Diana Hartley, whom I had met once at a diplomatic reception and found unremarkable. She sounded different now, not dramatic, not passionate. Calm, the way a person is calm when they have already done their grieving and are now simply stating facts. She said that all treaties, agreements, and partnerships with the Galactic Conquered were formally and immediately dissolved. She said that Earth did not seek wider conflict. She said that Earth sought accountability. She said that every human life taken by Resolution 7 would be counted, recorded, and answered for through whatever means proved necessary. She did not raise her voice once. The engineers around me had stopped working. They were listening. A few of them were very still in the way people get when something they prepared for finally arrives, and the preparation does not make the arrival any less heavy. Yusuf was watching them. His expression was not triumphant. It was the expression of a man who had spent 22 years hopping he was wrong and had just received definitive proof that he was not. "How long before the first Harrier wings are launch-ready?" I asked. 40 hours, he said. "Can you do it in 30? He looked at me. Something shifted in his assessment of me. I could see it happening in real time. "I can do it in 28, he said. I nodded. Outside the station's viewport, the asteroid belt drifted in its ancient slow orbit, rock and ice and silence, the same as it had always been. It looked patient. We were about to find out how patient the Conquered was. Survivor accounts from 3 of the 12 colony worlds had come through on Yusuf's deep archive channels, fragmentary, compressed, transmitted through methods I would only later fully understand. I read them while Yusuf's teams began their preparations. 2 of the 3 accounts were clinical, population figures, atmospheric processor status, casualty estimates. Necessary, useful, cold. The 3rd was from a colony administrator named Patrick Gill on Kepler Station 9. He had dictated it into a personal recorder while sitting in a sealed emergency shelter with 412 people, uncertain whether the shelter's independent air supply would last long enough. He did not describe the situation. He described the people. He named them. He described what they were doing while they waited, the conversations they were having, the small things they were worrying about, The jokes that were still somehow getting laughs because humor is apparently one of the last things humans let go of. He described a woman named Louise who had organized a card game in the corner of the shelter and was loudly insisting that nobody was going to just sit there staring at the walls on her watch. Patrick, Gill, and Louise and the other 410 people on Kepler Station 9 survived. The silence grid had hit the main atmospheric processors, but the colony's industrial team had done something remarkable. Within 6 hours of the initial attack, they had begun converting mining equipment into atmospheric stabilizers. Improvised, inefficient, loud, and completely effective. No manual, no blueprints. Just human beings staring at a problem and refusing to let it be the last thing they ever did. 2 billion people on other worlds had not been so fortunate. That number was in my chest every waking hour, a weight that did not diminish and that I was not trying to diminish. But 1 billion had survived, and somewhere in the gap between those two numbers was a lesson I intended to carry into every decision I made from that point forward. The Keth Dominion had fired a weapon designed to be quiet, designed to produce results that the rest of the galaxy could accept as unfortunate but inevitable, designed to remove humanity from the board without anyone having to acknowledge what removing meant. They had chosen the wrong species for quiet removal. The Harrier wings were ready in 27 hours. I was in the command center when the first wing launched, 18 vessels, compact and fast and built by human hands from human materials, carrying fold space charges and thread communications units and crews who understood exactly what they were doing and had chosen to do it anyway. They entered the asteroid belt's outer edge and disappeared into the dark. The Conquered had built its power on the assumption that history was written by whoever moved first and moved hardest. They had moved first. Now it was our turn to demonstrate what moving hard actually looked like when the species doing it had spent 10,000 years learning, the hard way, that the universe does not accommodate the unprepared. Sareth Vor's 72-hour patience window expired at 03:47 station time, exactly 24 hours after the 12 colony signals went dark. Our response had not been silence after all. It had been preparation, and preparation, when it finally moves, is something very different from the nothing they were expecting. Admiral Vrethsan had commanded Keth Dominion fleets for 30 years. She had overseen 8 containment operations, the Conquered's careful word for what they did to species that grew inconvenient, and all 8 had followed the same pattern. Initial strike, brief confusion from the target species, a period of distress communication, and then the inevitable calculation of survival odds followed by contact and compliance. It always followed that pattern. The pattern was so reliable that the Dominion's Strategic Planning Division had reduced it to a formula. Compliance Timeline Index, they called it. For a Class 4 species like humanity, the index projected full compliance within 96 hours of the initial action. At hour 97, Vrethsan submitted her first revised assessment. I did not know this at the time. I would read her logs much later, when circumstances gave me access to them. But I know now what she wrote at hour 97, sitting in her command seat aboard the Dominion flagship Absolute Accord, while her intelligence analysts looked at their screens with an expression she described in her log as professionally inappropriate confusion. She wrote, "The humans have not contacted us. They have not contacted any Conquered member. They have not evacuated Earth. They have not moved their civilian population centers. They have done nothing that our models predicted. Our sensors indicate significant activity in the outer solar system, but the nature of that activity does not match any known human technology profile." Then she wrote something that I have thought about many times since. She wrote, "I am beginning to suspect that our intelligence picture of human capability was built from what they chose to show us, rather than what they actually had." She was right, but she was only partially right, and the part she was missing was the part that would matter most. It was not just that we had hidden technology. It was that we had hidden a quality of mind. The Keth Dominion's analysts had spent years building behavioral models of humanity based on observation. They had watched humans negotiate, compromise, protest, celebrate, mourn. They had identified patterns. They had run the patterns through predictive matrices. What they had not modeled, because they had no frame of reference for it, because no species in conquered history had ever demonstrated it so clearly, was what happens to human beings when something is taken from them that they cannot get back. Grief in most species the conquered had studied produced one of two responses: withdrawal or submission. Grief in humans produced something the Keth had no word for. I barely have a word for it myself. It is grief that has been compressed, refined, and converted into something that functions like a second fuel source. It does not burn out. It does not fade. It becomes the reason every other reason points back to. I felt it myself. Every hour of those early days I felt it, the weight of 3 billion names I did not know, pressing on every decision, clarifying every calculation, not clouding my judgment, sharpening it. I was embedded on a frigate called the Dogged Truth when the assault on the Silence Grid relay station began. It was day 11 of what the press back on Earth was already calling the response, a word that captured something true, I thought. We were not initiating. We were answering. Captain Leonard Hewitt ran the Dogged Truth the way I imagined a ship ought to be run, directly and without theater. He was 41, from a coastal city in Wales, and he had a habit of narrating his own decisions out loud in a low voice, not for the benefit of his crew but for himself, thinking through consequences as he voiced them. I found this habit deeply reassuring during what happened next. The relay station was a Keth military installation positioned at the edge of what the conquered had quietly designated as human-adjacent space, close enough to monitor our communications, far enough to be outside any range humanity had ever demonstrated. It served as one of 19 nodes in the Silence Grid network. Without it, 2 of the 12 colony worlds that had survived the initial attack would have their atmospheric stabilizer signals restored. Leonard brought the Dogged Truth into engagement range at 600 on day 11. I was in the operations center, monitoring the tactical display, watching the dots that represented Keth defensive platforms arrange themselves in the standard defensive pattern that conquered military doctrine specified. Standard doctrine assumed the attacker would try to breach the outer perimeter at range and engage in a long exchange. Leonard did not do this. "Thread signal open," he said in his low, narrating voice. "Harrier wings confirmed in position. Fold charges in the pocket. We're going to go through the middle." He looked up at me. "Commander, you might want to hold on to something." I held onto the edge of the tactical console. The Dogged Truth went through the middle. What followed was 17 minutes of the most concentrated chaos I have ever experienced while technically remaining in a professional capacity. The fold charges opened holes in the Keth perimeter that their defensive systems had no protocols to address. The conquered genuinely believed the technology did not exist in this form, and a weapon you believe does not exist is a weapon you have not built a counter for. The Harrier wings came through the holes and hit the defensive platforms from inside their own perimeter. I lost 2 people I knew in those 17 minutes. A tactical analyst named Owen Park, who had been 2 years out of the academy and who had explained to me once, with genuine enthusiasm, why a particular approach to signal decryption was mathematically beautiful. And a weapons systems officer named Carla Donovan, who had a daughter back on Earth and had shown me a picture of her on the courier to Hephaestus. A small girl with her father's eyebrows and her mother's exact expression of focused determination. I held their names. I do not mean that metaphorically. I wrote both names on the inside of my left wrist with a marker I found in a drawer, and I kept them there for the duration of the mission. The relay station fell at 6:17, 11 minutes after Leonard Hewitt took us through the middle. The Conquered's response was not military, not immediately, it was diplomatic. A ceasefire envoy, traveling on a fast vessel under the white signal flag, the Conquered used for protected communications, reached Earth's outer sensor range at day 14 and requested a channel. I was pulled from the dogged truth to receive them. It was not an honor, it was a calculation. I was the senior intelligence officer with formal diplomatic credentials, which meant I was the person whose presence in the room gave the meeting legal weight. The envoy was a Morath collective representative named Suvan, which I mentioned because the Morath were the species whose ambassador had wept at a human music performance in New Geneva. I do not know if Suvan had been at that performance. I do not know if they personally had voted yes on Resolution 7. I know they were the face the Conquered chose to send. They were gracious. They expressed regret. They used careful, layered language that acknowledged harm without nomming it directly and proposed a framework for dialogue that would allow, as they put it, for both parties to move forward productively. I let them finish. Then I asked one question. Where were your negotiators when the vote on Resolution 7 was scheduled? Suvan paused. A very brief pause, but I had been reading alien body language for 11 years. It was the pause of someone who had prepared answers for many questions and had not prepared an answer for this one. They began to respond. I ended the transmission. Not out of anger, out of clarity. There was no version of that conversation that was worth having, because a ceasefire at this point meant freezing the current situation in place. And the current situation included a functional silence grid with 17 remaining relay nodes, 2 billion dead, and a Conquered political structure that had voted yes on all of it, and was now simply hoping that a few well-phrased sentences might be enough to make us set down what we had picked up. They were hopping. We were the kind of species that would weigh our losses against the difficulty of continuing, and find the mathematics too painful. They had miscalculated. I sent a report to Earth Command that night. I included Vreth San's revised assessment. We had intercepted it through the thread 2 days earlier. I included my own analysis. I wrote at the bottom of the report in plain language, they do not yet understand what they made us into when they did this. When they understand it, they will attempt to negotiate in earnest. At that point, we will have 2 choices. The first is to accept terms that allow them to preserve their power structure largely intact. The second is to pursue this until accountability is real rather than rhetorical. I recommend the second. Earth Command wrote back 6 hours later. 2 words agreed, continue. I forwarded the dogged truth the authorization for the next phase. Leonard Hewitt received it in his command seat. He read it, nodded once and said in his narrating voice, "Right then, we're going for the supply lines." Vreth San's log, which I read much later, recorded the following entry for day 16. The humans have targeted logistics infrastructure across 14 separate systems simultaneously. This is not the behavior of a species responding to crisis. This is the behavior of a species that has been planning. She was right about that too. We had been planning. For 22 years in a station in the asteroid belt, we had been planning. And we were only just beginning. The Conquered's legislative archive world was called Irath Soon, which translated, roughly, to the place that remembers. I found that name bitterly appropriate. It was a cold, dry planet with a thin atmosphere, covered in enormous data storage facilities that had been accumulating records since before humanity had developed written language. Every treaty, every negotiation, every vote, every resolution, sealed, categorized, and stored in environmental vaults designed to survive planetary-scale disasters. It was also, despite its immense political significance, lightly defended, not because the Conquered was careless, because they had never imagined anyone would want to breach it. You do not raid an archive. You do not need to. The information inside would be useless to an adversary because the context required to understand Conquered political process was itself so complex and layered that The conquered believed no outside party could extract anything actionable from raw records. The conquered had never had to reckon with the fact that humanity produces historians, intelligence analysts, and archivists as naturally as other species produce soldiers. I led the infiltration team myself. 6 people. Myself, 2 intelligence analysts named Harry Slade and Nina Akafer, a network specialist named Conrad Bell, and 2 security officers named Petra Lindqvist and Danny Marsh. We came in on a vessel that broadcast a Moreth collective registration, one of several cover identities Hephaestus Station had maintained for contingencies. We landed on the Archive World's secondary intake port, listed officially as a maintenance delivery. Harry had been briefed on conquered archival systems for 3 weeks straight before this mission. He moved through the archives network with the focused, almost serene efficiency of someone doing work they have prepared for thoroughly. What we were looking for were not humanity's files. We already had those. We were looking for the files that preceded us. Every species removed from conquered membership rolls over the past 500 years. Every vote taken in sealed session. Every ceasefire negotiation that ended with the smaller party accepting terms they had not agreed to and the archive recording it as consensus. Every instance of what the conquered called managed transition, which was their internal term for the process they had applied to humanity. There were 31 prior cases. I stood in the network access room on Erath soon and read the summary files as Harry pulled them. 31 species. Some had been small, single-world civilizations barely past their industrial era. Others had been significant, multi-system presences that the conquered had decided, at various points, exceeded their allocated space in the galactic order. The resolutions authorizing action against them had different numbers but identical language. The votes had different dates but identical margins. We had 3 hours before the archive's internal security cycle would detect our access pattern. Harry had been running a ghost protocol to delay it, but 3 hours was the outside limit. We broadcast everything in hour 2. Conrad ran the thread transmitter at full capacity, pushing the archive files out to every receiver we had positioned across the inner conquered systems. Receivers disguised as navigational buoys, as cargo transponders, as communication relays. The data went out in compressed packets, formatted for immediate readability in 17 languages, including the 6 primary dialects of conquered member species who were not the Keth Dominion. In hour 3, the archive security system found us. We ran. What followed was the longest 40 minutes of my life. The Archive World Security Forces were not military. They were administrative, designed to handle unauthorized access attempts by researchers and journalists, not a team with military-grade equipment. But they were numerous, they knew the facility layout, and they had the kind of institutional confidence that comes from never having faced a real emergency. We lost Conrad in the 3rd corridor, not permanently. He went down with a non-lethal hit from a suppression weapon, and Petra went back for him, carrying him through 2 more corridors while Danny and I held the junction behind them. Nina pulled Conrad's thread transmitter from his bag and kept it running the entire time. The broadcast did not pause for a single second of the extraction. We made it to the vessel at minute 38. We lifted at minute 40. The Archive World's 2 orbital defense platforms opened fire at minute 41, by which point we were already in fold space transit, and the shooting was purely punitive. Conrad had 2 cracked ribs and a concussion. He told me, in the medical bay, that the broadcast had transmitted 100% of the package before the archive cut the connection. Every file, every sealed vote, every one of the 31 prior cases. All of it, I said. All of it, he said. He sounded very tired and very satisfied. I held his hand for a moment. He went to sleep. The effect of the broadcast was not immediate. Information moved slowly through fear. But over the following week, 3 conquered member species withdrew their political support from the Keth Dominion. The Sul Assembly, the Drevath Compact, and a small but ancient civilization called the Vel Orum issued statements that used careful, legalistic language but arrived at an unmistakable conclusion. They had not been aware of the full scope of conquered practices, and they were requesting a suspension of consensus on all active resolutions pending independent review. Behind those official statements were back-channel communications. 2 of the 3 species contacted our thread network within 48 hours of the broadcast. They had suspected, they said. For a long time they had suspected. But they were small, and the Keth Dominion was large, and without an ally capable of making the suspicion matter, acting on it would have been signing their own managed transition order. Humanity was now capable of making it matter. The Keth Dominion's Inner Council convened an emergency session. Vreth San's logs from that period are dry and factual in the way that military logs always are, but the weight of what she was recording was visible in the gaps. The things she did not write, the entries that were only 2 sentences when they should have been 20. We were 42 days into the response. The Conquered had lost 7 more relay nodes, its primary logistics hub in Sector 19, and the political cohesion of 3 member species. The Keth Dominion's fleet was still vastly larger than Earth's. The raw capability gap between us was still significant. But capability, as I had been thinking for weeks, was not the variable that mattered. The Conquered sent a new envoy. This time they sent it directly to Earth, bypassing the military command structure entirely, a direct transmission to the Global Council, addressed personally to Chair Diana Hartley. The transmission acknowledged, for the first time, the use of the phrase act of extermination in reference to Resolution 7. It proposed an international tribunal. It offered reparations in the form of territory and resource access. It did not offer the names of those who authorized the vote. Diana Hartley transmitted her response through official channels. I was not present for its composition, but I read it afterward. It was 11 pages long and written in the careful, complete language of someone who intends every word to serve as a legal document. It accepted the premise of a tribunal. It specified, in exhaustive detail, the conditions under which Earth would engage in that process. And it named, by individual identity, the 23 members of the Conquered's inner chamber who had voted yes on Resolution 7, and the 17 members of the Keth Dominion's military command structure who had executed it. It was not an accusation. It was a list. A list is more precise than an accusation. A list does not argue, it does not emote, it simply exists. The Conquered received it. I know, from records obtained later, that Sarath Vor read it personally. I know that after reading it, they sat without moving for a period their aid estimated at 11 minutes. I was back on the dogged truth when Diana's response went out. Leonard was in his command chair, reviewing the next phase assignments. I told him what the council had transmitted. He was quiet for a moment. 11 pages, he said. 11 pages, I said. He nodded. Right then. He looked at the navigation display. We have a logistics depot in Sector 22 that won't move itself. I went to my station. Outside, the stars were the same as ever, patient, indifferent, enormous. They had been there before the Keth Dominion rose to power. They would be there after. We were making sure of it. The siege of Keth Prime took 9 days. I want to be precise about what that phrase means and what it does not mean. It was not a bombardment. It was not a destruction event. It was a blockade, a systematic encirclement of the Keth Dominion's home system that cut off every inbound supply route, every outbound military channel, every diplomatic back channel they had used to manage their sphere of influence for 3 centuries. Keth Prime still had power, still had food production. Its civilian population, somewhere in the range of 12 billion, was not in danger of the kind of immediate catastrophe that the silence grid had delivered to our colony worlds. I want to say that plainly, because precision matters when you are discussing these things. What we did and what was done to us are not the same, and I have no interest in pretending otherwise. What we were doing was making it impossible for the Keth Dominion to project its power outward, until it answered for how it had used that power. I was in the command room of the fleet's temporary flagship, a converted research vessel named the Open Question, when the decision came to me. My senior tactical officer, a serious woman named Grace Pemberton, laid out the option clearly. We had enough fold space charges positioned above Keth Prime's primary orbital infrastructure to end the siege permanently and decisively in a matter of hours. She did not recommend it. She presented it as a fact about our capabilities, which is exactly what I needed from her. I stared at the tactical display for a long time. Grace did not rush me. The honest answer is that part of me wanted to give the order, not the professional part, not the rational part, but the part that had written Owen Park's name on the inside of its wrist, the part that had listened to Patrick Gill's recording about Louise and her card game in an emergency shelter, the part that had read the names of 3 billion people and understood, at a cellular level, what had been taken. I gave a different order. We hold the blockade, I said, and we transmit the accountability terms to the Keth Dominion's civilian government, not the military command structure, directly to their public broadcast network. Grace nodded once. She turned to execute it. Leonard Hewitt, who had transferred to the Open Question as my tactical advisor, was sitting 3 seats away. He said nothing, but I saw him nod, very slightly, in the way of someone watching a decision they were not certain about being made in a way they find they can respect. The Keth Dominion civilian government received the terms. They were extensive and they were specific, and they were written, again, in the language of law rather than anger. A tribunal under neutral oversight, full access to the sealed vote records, named accountability for the individuals who authorized and executed Resolution 7. Dismantling of the Silence Grid Network, a reparations framework to fund the reconstruction of the 12 colony worlds over a 50-year period. And as the final condition, a formal public acknowledgement in the Keth Dominion's own broadcast channels, to their own population, of what Resolution 7 had done. Not a diplomatic communique, not a classified settlement, a public acknowledgement. The Keth Dominion's civilian population would hear it from their own government in their own language. The civilian government deliberated for 3 days. On the 4th day, they accepted. The military command structure, the 17 individuals named in Diana Hartley's 11-page list, did not accept. They transmitted a counter-proposal that amounted to a request for amnesty in exchange for testimony. The tribunal, which had been provisionally seated under the oversight of the Vel Orum and the Sul Assembly, reviewed the counter-proposal for 6 hours and declined it. The accountability proceedings began 12 days later. I testified on day 4. I had prepared my testimony carefully, organizing it around the evidence rather than the experience, dates, intercepts, archived communications, technical analyses of the Silence Grid's deployment. I was precise and thorough, and I spoke for 4.5 hours without notes. The presiding arbiter, a Vel Orum elder named Tass who had lived through 3 prior Concord managed transitions, asked me one question at the end of my testimony that was not on the official record. They asked, "What do you want the outcome to be?" I thought about it. I answered honestly. I want the outcome to be that no species ever has to sit in a monitoring bay and watch colony signals go dark because someone else voted that they were inconvenient, I said. I don't know how you build a legal framework that guarantees that, but I think you start by making the cost of trying it high enough that no one runs the calculation again. Tass was quiet for a moment. Then they said, "That is a reasonable answer." The reconstruction of the 12 colony worlds had already begun. Earth's engineering corps had deployed within days of the blockade starting, taking advantage of the reduced Keth military pressure to reach the surviving colony populations. I visited Kepler Station 9 at month 7. the first of the 12 worlds to be formally cleared for resettlement. The atmospheric processors were back online, new ones built to a different specification than the originals. With redundant systems and independent backup networks that no single external signal could disable. The colony administrator Patrick Gill was still there. He looked different than I had imagined him from his recording, older, quieter, carrying the specific kind of weight that does not lift, but that a person can learn to move with. He showed me around the settlement, new construction alongside the surviving structures, gardens being planted in the expanded greenhouse modules, children in an impromptu school that was operating in what had been a storage facility until a proper building could be finished. One of those children, a girl named Clara, maybe 6 or 7 years old, asked me if I was from Earth. Yes, I said. Is Earth nice? She asked. Very, I said. We've never been, she said, with the matter-of-fact tone that children use for enormous things. We were born here. I looked at Patrick Gill. He looked back at me. Well, I said to Clara, this is a nice place too, maybe nicer than Earth in some ways. She considered this with great seriousness. There are more stars here, she said. When it's night, there are more stars. That's true, I said. She went back to her friends. Patrick and I stood at the edge of the greenhouse looking out at the colony settlement, which was small and patched together and full of noise. Louise is running the town council now, Patrick said, elected by a lot. That sounds right, I said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, short and surprised, the kind that arrives before you remember that everything is still difficult. The tribunal convicted 14 of the 17 named individuals. 3 cases are ongoing as of my writing this. The sentences involve removal from positions of authority, asset sequestration, and binding cooperation with the reparations framework. Whether that is enough is a question that will occupy better minds than mine for a long time. The Galactic Concord, as it had existed for 5 centuries, did not survive the proceedings. What emerged in its place was smaller and newer, and built on a different premise, not consensus through managed dominance, but transparency as a condition of membership. Every vote public, every resolution open to independent review, every species with a documented right to legal representation before any action affecting their population could be authorized. The Vel Aurum drafted the founding charter. The Sul Assembly co-signed it. Earth's legal team spent 3 months contributing to the enforcement mechanisms. I read a draft copy on a transport vessel heading back toward the solar system and found myself thinking about Yusuf Ademi, who had been working quietly in an asteroid belt depot for 22 years because he understood history. I sent him a copy with a personal note. He replied, "It's a start." He was right, it was a start. I resigned my commission on a Tuesday, which felt like the right kind of day for it. No ceremony, no speech. I filed the paperwork through the standard channels and went to say goodbye to the Dogged Truth, which was in dry dock for repairs and upgrades. The crew was partly different from the crew I had embedded with at the start. The response had cost people across every vessel in the fleet, and those gaps had been filled by new people who would carry forward what the mission had been. Leonard Hewitt was still there. He shook my hand. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Kepler Station 9, I said. "They're building a school, a real one, permanent construction. They need people who can teach history." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "Someone should." I boarded a civilian transport 3 hours later. It was a modest vessel, slower than anything in the fleet, carrying a mixed passenger manifest of engineers, medical staff, and families returning to the colony worlds to begin the long work of rebuilding. I found a window seat. Outside, as we cleared the solar system's outer boundary, the stars opened up in the way they do when there is nothing between you and the full depth of space, vast and cold, and indifferent and present. Clara on Kepler Station 9 had said there were more stars from where she lived than from Earth. She was right. That's the thing about going further out. You see more. You understand the scale better. You stop being able to pretend the universe is a small and manageable thing. Humans had been doing that, going further out, refusing the comfortable smallness for a long time. Long before the conquered. Long before first contact. Long before anyone out there knew we existed and decided we were a problem to be quietly resolved. We had looked at an empty sky for 10,000 years and decided we belonged in it, without any evidence that the sky agreed. We had built vessels and aimed them at the dark and gone, because not going was a choice we were apparently incapable of making. That stubbornness had always been someone's problem. We had just finally made it ours to own rather than theirs to exploit. The transport accelerated. The solar system fell behind. I opened my notebook, actual paper, a habit I had maintained since my early intelligence training, and wrote 2 names at the top of the first page. Owen Park, Carla Donovan. And below them in the same ink, 31 species, 3 billion people, and everyone who is still here. It was not a complete list. It was never going to be a complete list, but it was a beginning. I was beginning to understand how everything worth doing starts.